Well, I think the first point that's really important for us to keep in focus is whether we're talking about Tunisia, whether we're talking about what's happening in Egypt right now, literally today on the streets, is it's first and foremost a result of the courage of the activism who are challenging the repressive governments. That being said, we are seeing a role of social media, I believe, in two ways in cases like this. There is some element of organizing that appears to be going on through, for instance, Facebook or comparable sites. And I think even more importantly, what we're really seeing is solidarity with the activists. And particularly around Tunisia, you saw the postings from people in Egypt and Yemen and Algeria basically saying, yes, we're with you. And I think that particularly that regional solidarity did play a role, particularly when there's that point that you don't know whether the police are going to come in and just kill everyone. And that solidarity, I think, was really important.
Can it be overstated sometimes? Because I think in Tunisia, I think there's some suggestion that it played a role, but there were other times in which there were plenty of people who were involved in the protests without being informed through social media.
Oh, it absolutely can be overstated. For instance, the young man who burned himself to death, who was the one who, in some ways, it was his death that sparked the protests, wasn't on Facebook, wasn't reading WikiLeaks. This is not about that. It is about the courage of activists who said enough is enough. Then, as much as possible, and it depends to a certain extent on how many people have access to the sites. And we know the Tunisian government tried to shut down sites, tried to absolutely censor access to the internet and what was going on, and actually tried to unregister the accounts of people who were using their email accounts or their membership on something like Facebook. So it absolutely can be overstated, but it is a factor.
How are organisations specifically who may be interested in organising protests or demonstrations, how are they tending to use social media?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's two different levels. There's organizations like Amnesty International where we try to get our members, keep them informed of things, ask them to participate in actions using, of course, our own websites and such. And then you have Avaz and other organizations that are really global in reach, where we're saying, if you're an activist who cares about this set of issues, come and join us. But it's a sort of diffuse solidarity. And I think what is interesting is when the actions are in a very specific location, challenging a very specific repressive government by the people living under that government's repression, where it's been particularly interesting because then the need to know, where are you gathering? You know, what is the police presence? What are the security risks? Becomes critical. And again, some people are going to have access to it, some people not.
And are you seeing regional differences? If we look at the world, are there particular regions where it's working more effectively and particular regions where it's not?
Well, again, going back to the Middle East, North Africa region, in some ways what's fascinating is it is a region where there's a fairly high rate of access to internet, and it's a region where there are so many governments who actually are trying to control the internet. And yet that is the region where this is really surfaced about it being a tool to challenge government repression and for organizations. So it's an interesting contrast that that's where it's happening. There are other places where we're just not seeing people have that, the percent of people in a country just simply not having that degree of access. So for instance, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where people don't have electricity, let alone access to a computer, we're not seeing it at that level that we're seeing in some other regions. China is probably the most interesting place. China probably now has more internet users than any other country in the world, and it's growing exponentially. And of course, we know the censors in China absolutely are trying to control both what's posted through the internet and on different sites and any organizing that goes there. So it's going to be another really fascinating place to continue to monitor what's going on.
Is this another case where the poor are disenfranchised? You mentioned that they may not have access to computers or electricity or whatever, and yet in a lot of cases the poor are the people who have most reason to be concerned about the violations of their human rights.
Well, that's an interesting question, because while the percent of people in some of the poorer countries who have access to the internet is low relative to a place like European countries where it's almost 100%, they're using the technologies that they can access. So the use of text messaging on cell phones, for instance, in Africa has been a very effective organizing tool. In fact, again, Amnesty International did work with this in our work in Kibera, the slum or informal settlement around Nairobi. So they're using the technology that they do have access to, and of course mobile technology doesn't require a huge infrastructure or a lot of money to work. And in fact, you have one of the interesting things is women who are buying mobile phones and then leasing it out to people who need it to make calls as sort of a micro enterprise technology. So again, it is growing, and I think we'll continue to see it grow. But yes, there is a difference. But the interesting thing is how you see poor communities seizing whatever technology is available to them.
Is this something different? Is this a new way of doing things, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, we've been talking about, how interesting it is to watch this develop. But when you think about it, the first printing press really revolutionized information, access to information, the ability to disseminate it. And of course, when you go back to the fall of the wall back in 1989, many people attributed fax machines and the ability of people to send faxes, and both in solidarity and to challenge the government, as an element there. And even when you think about Amnesty International's roots, Amnesty International started in 1961, where you started having global mail service everywhere. So the idea that you could flood a dictator's office with letters from Amnesty International members from all over the world, that had to happen at a time when it actually could happen. And so this is just another generation, very different in some ways, and yet it's about seeing technology not as deterministic. There's nothing inherently pro-human rights about the technology that we're seeing. It can be used to repress equally, but it is a tool for us, and it's a tool that we need to learn to use as intelligently and securely as possible.